Welcome back, listeners of the Randomness of Nothing podcast. This is your host, Rashad Woods. As always and promised, I bring exciting guests who bring different walks of life, perspectives, and inspire you to be better versions of themselves. This man encompasses this with his inspiring thoughts and his inspired purpose partners, and he's a well-traveled coach, entrepreneur. This is Mr. Tony Martignetti. Thank you very much, and I'm honored to have you on here.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here. We're going to have a great conversation.
I appreciate it. You also host workshops as well, too. So you're a well-rounded individual. So very much grateful for your time. Can you please give us some insight into your background, please?
Yeah. Before I got into this work, I spent quite a long time working in industry, particularly in high tech and then biotech, working on the finance and strategy side of the house. So it was a wonderful journey, but I felt like something was missing. And that's what led me down this path that had me exploring a different side of who I am, but also a way to contribute differently.
So I looked at some of your videos, and you host, you're a TED Talk speaker. You also inspire teams, and I saw where you do you're a leadership advisor, Chief Illumination Officer. I love the illumination, right? And I love one of your quotes where you said you want to make sure that you're a silo, not a constellation. So can you get into that a little bit? Because I was very curious about that.
Well, it's the other way around. It's more constellation versus a silo because.
Okay. Oh my God. Did I hear that backwards? I probably heard
It's all good.
I wrote it backwards. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'll just speak to the fact that illumination became very important to me because of the fact that I think it's so important that we're not just, being this walking around with this inner light, not being exposed to others. Oftentimes I'm thinking about this idea of the lighthouse. We don't do it just for ourselves, but we do it to help others find their way. Right. And so light is a big part of that illumination process, but also this idea that, being in a silo, you're limiting the impact that you can have with others.
Right.
And you're also limiting the way that you can create interconnections between different disciplines. So constellations are a wonderful way of looking at it because it's not just about how do I connect with others, but it's also how do I connect with different parts of myself and with different parts of what's out there. How do I become multidimensional?
Right.
And that's a big part of what I've been exploring over the years.
Do you find yourself, especially now in this era of everybody went through COVID, right? And obviously they found out how lacking of human connection can really take a mental toll, that entire disaster that took place. And did you find people came out and really needed more human interaction than they thought that they needed? And that, having the ability to talk to people and have purpose in their feelings. Did you find people coming out of that different than what you saw previously?
Yeah. I mean, COVID was a what I call a big flashpoint. That's a word that I use to say, a moment that has ignited our collective genius and, a collective reconciling of who we are. But I think the key thing is it was not just the only thing. Before that, we were already starting to retreat into ourselves. And there was a lot of loneliness, a lot of people who were just not creating paths to being social the way we should be. Right. And when you think about it societally, a lot of these, if you look back to Europe and the way things that, other cultures used to be, it was always around community. It was always about taking care of each other. Slowly, surely, we started to move away from each other and into an individualistic path. And now we're at this place where, social media and all the things that we have, the technology has created even more separatism.
Right.
And so I think the COVID created this thing of okay, now we're going to reckon with this idea that are we going to be really separate, or are we going to come back together post-COVID? Right. And I think that's where people are now, is we need to figure out how do we reconnect in a meaningful way, create deeper connection, but also see each other differently. And I think that's one of the things that I've been really focused on, is how do we understand ourselves and then understand each other more fully.
Now, obviously, things have evolved where it's not just, for lack of a better term, here's your assignment, do it. People now base a lot of things on their value system, whether it's, and there's more research out there than ever before about cultures, AKA toxic places that don't really, at the end of the day, you have to perform, but places that have been excessively rude or disrespectful. Now that those things are out there and people are aware of it, do you find that there's, as in your coaching journey, that you've had to have some cultural adjustments in some places that, were kind of like Wolf of Wall Street-ish kind of, or so to speak, that kind of say, hey, this doesn't work with this new generation of people. You kind of need to understand that you're dealing with a different generation, so to speak.
Yeah. I'll kind of speak to, first of all, yes, absolutely. The quick answer is yes. Yeah. But I also think of it as this way. It's almost like how, I'll speak in the language of biotech because this is where I came from. A system, an organ will reject something that comes into it and that, it doesn't really fit into the ecosystem. So if you try to bring something into your body that doesn't belong there, the first thing it tries to do is defend against it. It's an outside intruder. And so oftentimes we need to figure out, how do we build the immune system to create a path to protecting what we have inside. And I think that, the reason why I'm speaking in this way is because we have to find out, how do we create something really good and then protect what's good? Right. And that incivility is something that sometimes is systemic, but we have to find ways to make sure that what is good can be protected, and then we can help that be the thing that spreads inside of a system.
For sure. And so I thought it was very interesting, when you said, I saw when you said one of your leaders that you were inspired by, I believe it was the leader of Genzyme. It said, he came by the desk and he wanted to know about you. It was human centered. It was human focused, right? Because, to have the leader or somebody at a high level of a company come to, the rank and file employees and really get to know them. Like, oftentimes there's this impenetrable ceiling that they're not supposed to interact with some sort of level of person, right? When they could have came from the same environment, so to speak of, right? So that says a lot to people that they're willing to come down to the quote unquote floor and be able to have those things, see pictures of your kids, events, ask about somebody's illness or passed away. And then it's not just about, I'm not just a cog in the wheel, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And that's such an important aspect of, connecting with humanity. And it doesn't take a lot of effort to do that. I think there's a simple getting to know each other. It doesn't have to be about all of the, getting really super vulnerable, but it's just showing people that you care is going to make people want to care more about what they do. Right. And I think that is something that really goes a long way. And those little moments, micro moments of caring, can then amplify and continue to create ripples well beyond the moment. Right. So I think that's a key thing we can do to create more of a caring culture.
Right. And then, ultimately, and it helps them identify early trends too, because if you go down onto the floor or you go down to people's desk and then you sit back and say, this is normally a high performing department person field that's operating, this is a long-term employee, what happened, so to speak. And then either it could be a personal thing or they could say, professionally speaking, this team is not doing this because of these particular reasons, right? As opposed to necessarily just getting the data sort of in front of you and on to the next one, so to speak. But now you have that, hey, we were here on Friday, now we're here on Thursday. Everything seemed fine in that 4-window period. That there could have been something more than just the market, so to speak.
Yeah. And this is why it's so critical to not move so fast. I know leaders and people in organizations are always thinking like, go, 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 that speed is the rule of the day. We got to slow down and look at the things that we're missing. And that's where we can attune to what's really going on. And I think that's what you're speaking to, is this idea of, what is the temperature of this room and how do I make sure that I'm attuned to what people are feeling, what is really going on? Because otherwise you're going to miss that and people will move on and create their own sense of their what's going on for them.
Do you find a generational difference when people are trying to find their value and their worth, right? So now you have kids who are, the college market for all, for coming in and being a professional is very hard for them to break into than it was even 5-10 years ago. And then you have a generation that's older that maybe, is getting towards the tail end and they're like, I've kind of peaked in my career. And then you have a generation that can't get entry points in the career. So when you're doing your speaking and your coaching, what kind of people are coming up to you and what organizations?
Well, it really runs the gambit from, people who are later in their careers to earlier in their careers. And everyone's seeking something similar, but they're coming at it from different angles. Similar meaning like everyone wants to find meaning in the work, but they also want to be seen for who they are.
Right.
And I think that's something that's important. When you touch that nerve in someone that says like, you said something that really connected with, me being overlooked for who I really am and feeling like I go to organizations or work at companies and they just constantly, feel like I should be put in this box. And I don't want to be always put in that same box over and over again, because I feel like there's so much more of me than they see. And so that's one of the things that's really frustrating. But I also feel like there's motivations that keep people in this stuck mode. Fear of being, overlooked because they're old, right, or, on the later in their career, and fear of not being able to make momentum in the early parts of their careers. I mean, when you keep on getting the messages that are coming onto social media, and they're not fake really, but that that there are no jobs out there, that there are that people are being overlooked. AI is on the horizon. It's taking jobs.
Without question.
All those things are really challenging, and they don't just affect us on the surface level. They're getting to us deep down,
right,
and creating a visceral inner turmoil about like, what do I do now?
Right.
And who am I?
Yeah, I think that it definitely adds to people's stresses and anxieties, right? Because oftentimes, they realize that you need to adapt to in real time to what's taking place. It's, you can't, obviously there are factors that are out of your control, but I just in general speaking terms, it has a tendency for companies to overcorrect when there's a trend that takes place, right? Like everybody went all in on streaming, right? Like we have to be a streaming platform. And then everybody realized how inherently expensive it was. And now you see all these mergers and acquisitions that are taking place because even though they're pumping out content, some of these streaming platforms weren't profitable. Right. And then now you see, so now they have to put the quote unquote toothpaste back in the tube but everybody wanted to go in that direction. So now that you're looking at these generational changes, and I think, and I don't want to overspeak you, but I think people have a tendency to realize that they've kind of woken up, so to speak, because everybody was like, get the 4-year degree and everything's going to work itself out, so to speak. Right. You'll have 2.5 kids, the minivan, the pension, the whole 9 yards, right? And now people are like, wait a minute, that's kind of a fool's game.
Yeah, I love that you bring this up. First of all, this whole angle that you've taken is, the direction we're heading is a great way to think about this, is that we need to be thinking about our own path to success. You can't just keep on looking at the average person's definition or what success looks like in societal terms. We need to start thinking like, God, if everyone's going left, what does right look like? And I don't mean that in political terms.
Right.
What is my definition of success, and how can I be the most abundant and most fulfilled version of me, which is going to look very different than anyone else. The problem is when we start to kind of go to the norm, we start to go to everyone's doing this and therefore I need to do that. Then we compare ourselves to everyone else and then we never can measure up.
Without question.
So I think the best thing we can do is trying to figure out what makes us weird, what makes us interesting, weird in a good way, what makes us uniquely us, and how do we create our value in our own way and do that. And even when it feels like it's not working, keep doing it. Keep trying new angles in the same thing, because what happens is that's where we create the most fulfilling path to our own life.
That's the thing, right? So like, when you're in college, you're not too far from age from me, I'd imagine, right? So, I'm 43, so we're probably of the same ilk, watching He-Man and, as kids and all those things.
Yes.
So there was this mentality from, that was like, you have to get on the honor society. You have to make sure you fill out all your FAFSA and meet with, because if you don't get that 4-year degree, somehow you're deemed as a failure, or you're, it all permeated in people's minds that everybody kind of had to go on this, next some shady kind of factory assembly line that you had to all be the same. If you didn't have the degree, you were a failure. And if you didn't graduate from that big school, that was a failure. And if you were to tell, your parents like, hey, I want to be a chef, or hey, I want to be, a carpenter, somehow that was looked down upon, even if that was your passion, because everybody needed to have the MBA or the business degree, so to speak. And I think it missed the mark, and it led to a lot of the speeches that you're giving. And I only say this because I can imagine a lot of people would say, I wish I followed my passion. I wish I truly would have just took that chance. Even if I didn't get paid immediately, I was happy.
Yeah. So I just love what you're sharing, because this is exactly, everyone's going at their own pace, and that's wonderful. I mean, you think about, the well-meaning adults, and for me, I had the same experience. I was an artist who was going to potentially become an architect. Then I switched into pre-med, and then eventually led down this path of look, I'm not going to be a doctor because that's not really who I am. Right. But I ended up working, getting into business and spending time in biotech, which was wonderful. But at the end of the day, we have to kind of follow the threads of what is it that is my path, and go at my own pace and figure out where that leads. Right. People who don't go to get a college degree can still be a billionaire, never mind a millionaire.
No question.
Yeah, the key thing is just to continue to figure out, what is this thread creating for me? How do I continue to show up every day, do the work, and not expect other people to give to me? I mean, you have to put in the effort and find the connections that open the door for you.
It was almost like I was listening to one time on YouTube when Ice-T said the first time he heard Eminem, and he was like, it's hard for me to hear people's music and actually listen to it because everybody sounds the same. And he's like, then I hear this guy's, demo, and he's talking about put his girl, and I'm not advocating for this for people who are listening. He's like, I hear this guy talking about his girlfriend in the trunk of the car, and he's like, yo, I've never heard anybody say anything like this. So he was telling people, if you want people's attention and you want to stand out, think about what everybody else is doing and do something completely different. And he said he was blown away. He was like, I listen to demos all the time. And he's like, I'd never heard anybody say that. You know what I mean? So I'm paraphrasing, obviously what Eminem did was fictitious. So this is not the show where we advocate, those type of behaviors. But artistically, he stood out, right? Because he was like, this is who I was and this is who I am. And I think that's wonderful.
I love that you bring Eminem into this, because I think he is an interesting character for that reason, for many reasons. I mean, just, the way he brought in Dido to the song Stan, a lot of interesting things that he weaved in that made it interesting. Now, of course, he's not perfect. I mean, no one's perfect, but that's great. I mean, that's kind of what we're looking for. Another artist who came to mind for me was in a very different genre, because I just happened to be at South by Southwest this past week, and Jack Johnson, this surf musician, he was a champion surfer. I mean, he won many different competitions as a surfer. Then he transitioned into making films. Amazing. And then became a musician. Right. So he had 3 different paths, an arc that he probably didn't expect any of those things to all come together. But now when you look at him, you can see how all 3 of them influenced each other.
Right. And you see how things happen organically with people because they keep carving out that lane. And then you realize sometimes, and companies are notorious for this because they think that things aren't going to work because that the audience, they made up the audiences or mind for them and didn't realize how big of an actual audience there was for certain things. And I only say this not to go too much off a tangent, was John Wick. I just watched a documentary on the making of the John Wick movies, right? It's on Peacock. It's wonderful. And there was no confidence that movie was going to get made or make a lot of money because, Keanu Reeves hadn't had a hit in a long time. It was about a hitman and his dog. And you're just like, but the lack of confidence they had into it became this sleeper hit. But it was shaky cam action movies before that. And this was a real stuntman making movies with a guy who was really trained in martial arts. And there was an audience starved for that type of material. And they didn't know how badly people really wanted that until it went to South by Southwest or a film festival and was seen. And then it blew up, right?
Yeah. I mean, now how many John Wick films have there been now?
4. Right.
Crazy. crazy.
So, obviously I don't want to get too much into pop culture on there, so I apologize for that. So can you explain about like your coaching and your workshops and, what you do in that regard?
Yeah. I mean, the big part of my work is really helping people to uncover what I call hidden brilliance. And it really comes from this element of discovering elements of themselves that maybe they've sidelined or felt like it didn't belong in their professional world. And through this process, I get into this thing called, distillation, which is allowing them to figure out what is they can bring back to the table. How do they play with that identity and integrate it into their world? And then design around that. So I'm using a lot of D words because it's called the Illumination Framework, and it's around 4 Ds: discover, distill, design, and then deliver. And through this process, it's not just an individual endeavor, it's also something that teams can do together that allows them to not only get to know themselves, but also figure out how to connect better together so that they can innovate, create together. And I've taken it to one more level, which is I've also created this thing called Illumination Councils, which I facilitate inside organizations and allow them to do the work and with a guide, myself taking them through this journey to discover themselves together.
How do you, and this is going to sound like a corny question, how do you get the people on board that look at team building exercises and kind of say, oh, yeah, they roll their eyes, they're the first one, they sit the closest to the door, they're there just for the coffee and donuts. And then as soon as they're trying, how do you rope that person in?
Yeah, against their will. No, I'm kidding. No, honestly, it's first you have to kind of build a container of trust. And I think the key thing is to say, hey, look, how are things working the way they are right now? If there's something that you're finding that's not working well, are you willing to try something different? Are you willing to explore a path that would potentially give you a different result than you've already had? Right. And if that is something that, if you engage them in a vision of something that's different, that's might break the door open a little bit. Yeah. And then I get them into the things that really will break down the barriers. And that one thing is I have them do art or create something, do something creative, because what that does, it gets them out of their mind and into their something that's a little bit foreign to them usually. And so through this process, they start to really do something different.
It's interesting because people want to get their voices heard until you actually get them in a room to have them get their voice to be heard. And then, and then you're like, wait a minute, dude, you complain for like 6 months that nobody listens to what you have to say. We hold a meeting in good faith that we want to actually hear what you have to say. And then the first thing you want to do is, how quick is this over?
Yeah. I mean, you have to take them through an arc, you have to get them to get out of their heads and into their hearts. At some point that arc allows them to really move away from having to know and just to embody who they are. And one of the things I always think about is this, it comes from my second book, which is about divergent minds and convergent hearts. And this idea of like, we want people who think differently to get in rooms and to share how they think, not always have to agree, but what we want them to do is to care about each other. And that's where the convergence of hearts means is it's like, even if they leave still not agreeing, that's fine. But what you want them to do is to care enough about each other that they're like, yeah, I got you. I see you.
Yeah. And I think that goes a long way, because the reality about it is that, you're never the smartest person in the room. And, I've said 1,000 times on this show that the one fortunate distinction is I'm not smart enough to create what y'all do. I'm really not. Like, I biotech and, people who are finance engineers and, people who invent things. I'm like, listen, I'm just the guy that talks to you all. Right. Like, so I get the fortunate distinction where I'm like, you can tinker in your garage for 6 to 8 months and, MVP and prototype it. I'm just fortunate enough to ask and talk to you all. But I don't slight myself in that, but I understand I'm in a much different position in the same sense that, what you guys do and putting yourself out there is a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of good. And I'm sure you've heard some heartbreaking stories throughout your entire travails, because people really do have, carry the world and burdens on their shoulders. So for that, I want to thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful. And I think, the key thing is knowing, what it is that you uniquely bring to the table, and knowing that you don't have to have all the answers. No. What you do need to have is your presence and how you bring your unique brilliance into the.
Yeah, 75% of it is actually just having halfway decent people skills, right? And that's why you see people who can jump from different businesses to different businesses, even if they don't have they can jump from packaging to biotech to food, because they know processes and they know people. They may not know exactly how to make the product at hand, but they have a good idea of the feel of the room.
Yes, you got it.
Yeah. So where can people, I always ask this question, and obviously, your story is not encompassed in a 20, 30 minute interview, but where can people find Tony Martignetti?
Oh, the best way to find me is on my website, tonymspeaks.com. So you can find me there. That's my new website. So there's a few kinks being worked out, but you can find me there. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Tony Martignetti, with a 1 at the end, not an I. Yeah. So you drop that in the chat. I'm very active on LinkedIn, always sharing what I can to help elevate the voices there. So,
and I would encourage people, if the worst thing you can do is sit on your couch and hope for a break. You're not going to wish anything to existence. I always wanted to do a podcast, but nobody was going to force me off my couch to actually interview people until I was willing to fall flat on my face doing it. So I'd rather fail trying than take that to my grave, and that's the truth. Yeah. So I want to thank you for your inspiring words and wisdom, and continued success to the work that you do.
Thank you so much, my friend.
I appreciate you. Stay warm, okay?
You bet.
Bye. Well, that was fun.